The harness is probably the only piece of equipment that we use on our dog that has got a negative impact on it before we attach the lead, before the human gets involved. This is classed as a restrictive harness because potentially it restricts the movement of the front legs when it sits on the dog like that. The thing to bear in mind when we're looking at harnesses is this part of the dog, the shoulder girdle, if you like, is very different to humans, which is why we can't just put a strap around here as a way of explaining why harnesses aren't very good for dogs. We've got a collarbone, which a dog hasn't got, or if it has got one, it's just a tiny little stump there. It doesn't really do anything. When you look at our anatomy, our rib cage is like this, and the collarbone keeps everything back in place. But because the dog hasn't got one, and the dog's rib cage is more that shape, when it moves, when it runs, the shoulder slides around the rib cage like that. As it extends its front legs, the shoulder moves around the rib cage. So it's gliding forwards like this. It's actually moving that way as the dog runs. Now, if you've got a harness here, the strap's going across the front legs, it's going to potentially impact the movement of the front legs. If you've got a Y-shaped harness, which is generally called a non-restrictive harness, that sits down the front of the shoulder blade here, when the dog extends its shoulder and the shoulder blade glides around the rib cage like that, if it's fitted correctly, the non-restrictive harness will at some point hit that moving shoulder blade, and that will cause an impact on the gait. That will limit the movement of the shoulder girdle, of the shoulder blade on the rib cage. There was a 2018 study by Lafuente, I hope I've pronounced that right, who found that the Y-shaped non-restrictive harness actually had a greater impact on the dog's gait than the restrictive harness because of this movement that takes place on the shoulder as the dog extends. For me, one of the biggest problems with a harness is the fact that people are buying them off the shelf. They're not particularly well fitted, and as the dog grows, the puppy grows, or the dog changes shape because of maturity or because it's put weight on or lost weight, the fit of the harness isn't great. So even if it's well fitted, it can have a negative impact on my dogs. According to the studies that I've found and that I've done reviews on, what they have found is that regardless of whether it is a restrictive or non-restrictive harness, it will have a negative impact on the dog's anatomy, on the dog's movement, and on the dog's gait. So the restrictive harness will restrict the forward movement of the front legs. The non-restrictive harness will have a negative impact on the shoulder girdle and the shoulder rotation. But what was found by Carr et al. In 2017, they concluded that it was the amount of material that was touching the dog, which I found really interesting. So the more of the harness that is on the dog, so these really fat, fluffy harnesses, they have got an even greater negative impact on the dog than the thinner harnesses because of the proprioception system. So the proprioception system is how the brain and the body communicate. Inside of the muscles, we've got something called a spindle cell, and that tells the brain whether the muscle's overcontracted. And so if there's pressure, if there's a greater pressure on a greater surface, then more spindle cells will be involved, and they will tell the brain to restrict movement because of the amount of pressure taking place on the muscles. So there's lots of different reasons why the harness isn't the best piece of equipment to use on your dog. The main one for me is the fact that even before you attach the lead, even before human gets involved, just the fact that you've got a piece of equipment that is restricting the dog's movement, either on the shoulder girdle and the rotation of the shoulder blade on the rib cage, or the movement of the front legs, or because of the amount of equipment that is touching the dog and therefore having an impact on the proprioception system, that is the reason why I personally do not like harnesses, because before you attach the lead, it is impacting the dog's structure. Attaching the lead, that's a completely different thing. Dogs are sentient beings. They are also into pressure, which means some dogs, when they feel the pressure of the harness on them, will come back and recoil away from it. And other dogs, which are most dogs, will actually start leaning into the pressure because they are into pressure animals. So just by putting a harness on them and putting that pressure on the dog, it will trigger the dog to pull. I'm no longer at university studying the harness and dog training equipment, so I believe anybody that picks up the research going forward really needs to be looking at the impact of the harness without a lead attached, and that will give a greater indication of what the harness is actually doing. As soon as you start adding leads and people, that is a completely different piece of research that needs to be carried out. If you're interested in more information on canine anatomy, dog training and dog training equipment, then be sure to give me a follow.